Chapter 6. Jeremy pushed Greg's wheelchair into the church building, and Greg took it from there, maneuvering it around people and down the aisle until he had a good vantage point. He so badly wished he could walk in there and be the strong support Candice needed, but if he exerted himself too much, he could throw his recovery in reverse, and that's the last thing he wanted. He'd be careful today, so he'd be stronger tomorrow, another saying he'd picked up at physical therapy. Candice came over and sat down on a bench next to him, clasping her hands in her lap. "The mayor's going to be here in a few minutes," she said quietly. "And Zachary got the chief of police to come. Why am I in charge of this again? Why haven't I turned this over to someone older and more experienced?" "Because you're the one who understands the urgency," Greg replied. "You and Marty are the only two who really get what's about to happen, and I have the feeling Marty's talents are being used a little differently right now." Candice looked at him. "I'm so glad you're not scared of me anymore. It's much nicer when you believe in me." He opened his mouth to contradict her and say that he hadn't been scared of her, but that would be a lie. He might not have been shaking in his boots, but he'd definitely been nervous until he understood better, and that, he had to admit to. "I like it better too." She smiled, then froze as she looked over his shoulder. "The mayor's here. I guess I should go greet him." "Probably." Greg turned to look for himself. The man didn't seem very intimidating. In fact, he looked kind of short and fat, but Greg didn't live here, so he didn't know anything about the mayor's accomplishments or reputation. Maybe he'd be more intimidated if he did know those things. "I'll be back." Candice stood, tugged down her sweater dress, and made her way up the aisle, where the mayor stood chatting with the pastor. Greg settled back in his chair and studied his surroundings. This was a nice church building, simple, understated, yet reverent. There were a few stained glass windows up behind the pulpit, very tastefully done. He hadn't been to church regularly for a while, but he was a praying man, and it felt good to sit quietly in a church and appreciate it. Candice came back and sat down again. "My family's here, all 3,000 of them, and I think we're ready to get started." 3,000? Greg chuckled. "It sure feels like it sometimes, but in a good way." "Oh, and did I mention that Heather's having 4 babies? We don't know how to have small families in the McClain clan." "Sounds pretty nice to me. Jeremy and I sometimes wondered what it would be like to have more siblings, especially a sister." "Well, you can borrow mine anytime. I have enough to spare." Candice stood up. "Okay, here I go." Greg watched as she stepped to the center of the room. She wasn't standing at the pulpit, but below it, and he thought that showed respect for the building and for their purposes that night. She wasn't there to preach, so she didn't try to give the impression that she was. She stood for a moment until the chatter began to quiet, and then she spoke. "Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm pretty sure I know all of you here. That's one of the best parts about living in Bagley, but in case we've missed each other somehow, I'm Candice McClain. I'd like to talk with you a little bit and share some ideas about how we can be better prepared as a community in case of natural disaster." She glanced at Greg, and he gave her an encouraging smile. "My cousin, Peter, would like to share an experience he had," Candice said, motioning for him to come up to the front. Peter was a pretty young guy, maybe a couple years older than Greg, and he'd recently been married to a young woman named Lillian. Greg had gathered from conversations around him that the McClain boys' ranch was being transitioned over to Peter's care, and that Jonathan and Meredith would go into semi-retirement. Greg hoped that he'd be able to keep all these names and faces straight. There really was a lot to memorize in this family. "Hi, all," Peter said, raising one hand. "Candice and I were talking the other day, and I mentioned a friend of mine, an engineer, who came out for a visit last summer. We were fishing out by the dam, and he mentioned that he didn't think it would hold in case of heavy rainfall. When I mentioned this to Candice, she suggested that we get together as a community and talk about what we'd do if the dam were to fail, a way of preparing for the future. He said it calmly, and Greg was impressed. It was a great way to introduce the topic and get people talking without causing panic. Candice took the floor again. We talked about all the things we'd want to have on hand in our homes, and then we traced where the water would most likely flow. We'd want to have sandbags at the ready, along with tractors and backhoes, to plow up the earth and create a new channel for the water to take. One man in the middle of the room raised his hand, but spoke before he was called on. Are you saying that we should be out there in the middle of a flood digging up dirt? That's dangerous, Miss McClain. I mean that we should be considering these things now, she replied. We've never seen rain like this in Bagley, at least, not during my lifetime, and if that dam wasn't built up to these kinds of specifications, we might want to start preparing. Well, I can't see going through all that hard work for no good reason, the same man replied. I have enough to do, don't have time for busy work. Steve stood up. I live on property pretty close to the dam, and after talking to Candice and Peter, I went ahead and spent the afternoon plowing up some of my dirt and building a furrow to guide the water away from my place. I consider it time well spent because I'll have peace of mind. Can't put a price on that. I can see this as a good project for the spring, but right now? I'm just so busy, a woman on the west side of the room said. But it's raining right now, Steve replied, and several people began to mutter. The mayor stood up and lifted both hands. I'm sure Miss McClain isn't trying to stir anyone into a panic here, he said. We're just discussing possibilities, right, Miss McClain? You aren't saying the dam is actually going to break, are you? Candice looked over at Greg. He wished he had anything to offer her, but he wouldn't know what to do either if he was in her position. Mr. Mayor, I think it's wise for us to prepare as though we had sure and certain knowledge that something was about to happen. Then we'd have all our safeguards in place, and we'd sleep better at night knowing that we'd be ready. The mayor turned and looked helplessly at Bob McClain. Bob, what do you make of all this? Your daughter seems to be feeling a little negative today. Several in the room chuckled, and it made Greg angry. They were poking fun at Candice, and that wasn't right. Bob stood, and the room quieted to hear what he'd have to say. My wife and I raised our daughters to have heads on their shoulders, and if they're using their heads for the good of the community, of course I'm going to support them in that. Candice has done her research, and I stand behind her 100%. Believe you me, I don't want to be the one left without toilet paper in case of an emergency. Everyone laughed again, but this time it was an appreciation of the humor. That was better. Go ahead, Candice, Bob said, motioning to her, and she swallowed. In severe cases, some homes would need to be evacuated, so I recommend that each household comes up with an evacuation plan, she continued. Each family member should know the safest way to exit the house, and you should establish a meeting place outside so everyone knows where to go once they evacuate. An older woman just behind Greg stood up. When I heard about this meeting, I thought we were going to be making first aid kits or something important like that. This whole thing is just nonsense. We don't have floods here, we never have. Why should we prepare for something that's never happened? Because we've never had rain like this, Candice replied, feeling as though they'd already said this a dozen times over. We need to prepare differently when we're having different weather conditions. I'm sorry, Candice. I know you're a sweet girl and your heart's in the right place, but I think this sort of conjecture is a waste of time. Little by little, those in the group trickled out through the double doors, and Candice looked like she was becoming upset. Greg wished he could comfort her, but even wrapping his arms around her would feel like a shallow, surface gesture. She needed something that truly spoke to her on a deeper emotional level, something that would tell her just how very much she meant to him. And a necklace or a pair of earrings wasn't what he meant. He stood up as well, turning to face the room. Wait. Please, wait a moment. Those people who were halfway out came back, curiosity on their faces. Evening, everyone. My name is Greg Burton, and I'm a ham radio operator out of San Antonio. Jeremy Burton here is my brother, and he works in town as a paramedic. One thing we both noticed, him out taking emergency calls and me forwarding emergency information, is that people tend to react better when they've practiced it and know what they do in any given circumstances. When they have a game plan in their heads, their survival rates go up. There's less scrambling, there's less chance of a child slipping away. On just about every level, preparedness is the best choice. Now, you might not take Candice's word for it, but please take mine. I've spoken to countless victims of disaster over the radio, and I know it's true, being prepared is never a waste of time. I have some handouts here to explain what you can do to get ready, Candice said, flowing from his comment right into hers. Please pick one up on the way back. I've broken it down into steps so you can do a little at a time and not get overwhelmed. Greg watched as all the remaining people stepped over to the table in the back and took a pamphlet. He had no idea if he'd said anything that was actually helpful, but at least the mass exodus had slowed to a trickle. For the rest of the hour, Candice walked the group through the handout, explaining different terms and telling them where to buy the various items they'd need. She stayed very much in control, and Greg nodded from time to time. He didn't know whether this was information she'd already had or if she'd somehow pulled it together since that morning, but it was impressive and comprehensive. By the end of the meeting, several people had commented that they'd go home that night and assemble a first aid kit and fill up some water bottles. That was a start, but nowhere near what was needed. At least, Candice had gotten them thinking about what they'd grab in case they needed to evacuate, and he hoped they'd discuss safe egress routes from their homes and where to meet up with family members. Those were some of the most important things. When the last person left and all the remaining people were family members, Candice flopped herself onto the bench next to him. Do you think anyone was really listening? Do you think we did any good? If nothing else, you got them thinking about it, and the information will be fresh in their minds. He put his arm around her shoulders and kissed her forehead. You're amazing, you know that? The whole time you were up there, I kept thinking, she could work for the Red Cross. You'd never get rich, but I don't think that's what you're after anyway. Candice looked at him, her eyes huge. What did you say? You aren't interested in getting rich? No, the part about working for the Red Cross. What? You look like I just said something really weird. No, I think you said something really wonderful. I've been trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. I've tried a few different jobs, but none of them have seemed to fit. I want to do something useful, something important. I want the fact that I live to mean something when I'm no longer here. The Red Cross might be what I've been looking for. He held up a hand. Don't go running off to apply just on my say-so. I think you'd be fantastic at it, but that doesn't mean it's right, and that doesn't mean they'll hire you. Of course I realize that, but it puts me in mind of several other organizations where I could apply if that doesn't work out. She grinned at him. You're pretty fabulous, you know that? You've just opened up a giant black curtain in my brain, and now all this light's flowing in, and I'm having ideas left and right. That sounds kind of painful, but if it's useful, hey, glad there was something I could do. Bob and Barbara walked up, Bob's arm around Barbara's shoulders. That was fantastic, Candy Cane, Bob said. You did a great job. Candy Cane? Greg smirked. Oh, it gets even worse, Barbara said good-naturedly. Bob's is a brand of candy cane, you see. So when Candice was born and we named her, the first thing my husband said was, she'll be a Bob's candy cane. We can't have just one joke or pun at a time, we have to layer them. I see. Greg was still smirking, and he could tell that Candice was annoyed. It fits her. No, it doesn't. Candice rolled her eyes. Should we get out of here? I know Tracy and Steve volunteered to stay after and vacuum, and they're probably antsy for us to get out of their way. Probably so. Barbara slid her arm through Bob's as they walked out, and Greg reached to take Candace's hand. I hate saying goodbye to you. I feel like we have so little time together before everything hits the fan. I think it pretty much hit the fan in the middle of the night, but I totally understand what you're saying. She gave his hand a squeeze. When this is over and everyone's safe and we've done all we can do, I'm going to sit still, stare into your eyes, and do nothing else for hours on end. That's what we should be doing right now, but fate had some other ideas. We'll just postpone all that stuff until later. I'm not sure I want to stare at you for hours on end. I think I'd rather talk to you and go out to eat and watch movies together. Yeah, I like that idea too. Jeremy walked up, ready to push the wheelchair out to the car, and Candace gave Greg a quick kiss. See you at church tomorrow. Oh, I forgot, everyone comes over to the house after church and we have crazy big meals. That sounds great. What do you mean by everyone? Like, the whole congregation, or the whole family, she replied. And since you're family now? He watched as her face turned red. Since we're such good friends, and since you're Jeremy's brother. I didn't mean that you have to marry me now or something. Jeremy and Greg both laughed. It's okay, Candace, Greg said. I understand what you mean. Actually, I think you do have to marry her now, Jeremy interjected. You know the secret of the McClains now. That ties you to them in strange and mysterious ways. Even if you manage to escape, there will always be strings pulling you back. Candace gave him a look. Strings like my mother's cooking, for one. Night, Greg. I'll see you tomorrow. She preceded them through the doorway, and Greg watched as she dashed for her car, her coat held up over her head. Not that it would do much good, her coat was probably already damp. The two of you would be great together, Jeremy said, standing behind the wheelchair. You know what, I think we would, Greg replied. Jeremy came around to the front of the chair and leaned on the doorjamb, his expression serious. While we were sitting there in the meeting, it occurred to me that you might not want to stay here. You were asked to help get us off the ground with the radio, but you're not obligated to stick around. Do you want me to drive you back to San Antonio? What? Greg shook his head. Are you kidding me? I'm not going to leave now, not when things are about to get scary. I wouldn't leave Candace like that, and yes, you have a radio, but you don't know how to use it, and you're not a licensed operator anyway. Then he blinked as the deeper implications set in. Are you worried that I won't be able to handle it? Jeremy pressed his lips together. I'm worried that you might overdo and get hurt. I know your heart, Greg. You want to get in there and help. Right now, though, that's not a good idea. I know, and yes, it's frustrating. You have no idea how frustrating. But I'll be careful. I want my recovery to be a success. When I'm healthy, I'll be able to help even more people. I promise, I'll stay behind the radio. I won't hurt myself. Good. Jeremy clapped him on the shoulder, then took hold of the chair again. Let's get home. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. Chapter 7. Candace had told herself dozens of times to go to sleep, but it wasn't working, and she finally sat up and flipped on her lamp. Her brain just wouldn't shut up. She went out into the kitchen and grabbed herself some crackers, then sat down at the counter and stared at the phone. She really wanted to talk to Galen, but it was crazy late at night, and calling someone in the middle of the night was rude. But wasn't that what sisters were for, to forgive your rudeness? She finally picked up the phone and dialed Galen's number, hoping her sister would answer and not Zachary. She liked Zachary a lot, he was a great guy, but he was a police officer, and police officers needed their rest, and it was so much easier to wake up her sister. Hello? Galen sounded wide awake, and Candace relaxed a little bit. Hey. I'm sorry to bother you, but can I talk to you for a few minutes? Galen laughed. Of course. In fact, I was just about to call you. You're carrying a lot of burdens right now, little sister. Are you all right? I think I am, Marty says I am. At least, she keeps telling me no one's going to die, and that's what I'm clinging to right now. Yeah, I cornered her tonight and asked her the same thing. I think we're all worried about that. Injuries and property damage are so much easier to deal with. Death? That takes everything to a whole new level of awful. It really does. Candice wrapped the phone cord around her finger while she spoke. So, how do you think it went tonight? Were people listening? I think several of them were. The rest, it was hard to say. Greg said that I got people thinking, at least. And I'd say that Greg's right. Galen paused. So, what's going on there? Between me and Greg? That's a tough question. Less than 12 hours after we decided to date, we decided the town was going to be destroyed. That doesn't exactly set things up for a great romance. Not a traditional one, at any rate. Do you like him? Tell me the truth now. Candice chuckled. Yes, I like him. A lot. It's just weird because I never thought about him that way until Marty suggested it. And how do you feel about his disability? Galen's question, although mildly asked, brought Candice up short. What do you mean? I mean, does the fact that he's still in a wheelchair most of the time bother you? I don't know. Candice sat back and blinked. Was it bothering her? Galen could see right into the heart of any matter, and if she thought it was an issue. If it's bothering me, I don't think it's conscious, but maybe on some level, I'm worried about him getting hurt. I think it would be worth your time to think about it, Galen said. How would you feel if he lost the progress he's made, and he's in that wheelchair forever? Would you care about him differently than you would if he made a full recovery and started running circles around you? One thing I've learned is that we do tend to create feelings about people based on their circumstances, and yes, you would relate to him differently in those two instances. But in each case, would your feelings be open and loving? You're asking me if I'd resent becoming his caretaker, Candice said. In a roundabout sort of way, yes, that's what I'm asking, Galen replied. Candice sighed. She'd thought calling Galen would make her feel better, but now she wondered about that. To be honest, I think I'd feel we had more of a partnership if we were both healthy, she said. That doesn't mean that I'd break up with him if he had a relapse, it just means that I'd probably think about our relationship differently. There's also this, being his caretaker doesn't mean that you're better than he is, or that you're on separate levels somehow. You can take care of someone and still be their equal. That's true. I've just never thought about being with someone who might need my help like this, it's just not something that's entered my mind. That might be the case, but you'd be excellent at it. Greg says he thinks I should work for the Red Cross. Really? Galen sounded interested. You'd be great at that too. Again, not something I'd considered, but ever since he brought it up, I can't stop thinking about it. Really getting out there and helping people, going in and seeing to their needs, right now, it seems perfect in every way. You've been floundering for a while now, little sister. This is the first time I've heard excitement in your voice in months, maybe. Then you think I should look into it? What I think doesn't really matter. It's what you think, and that seems to be a yes. Candice grinned. I think you're right. Okay, after we deal with this flood situation, I'll go see what I can find out. And yes, I am making plans for after the flood. That's part of what's keeping me sane right now, visualizing how everything will be fixed or rebuilt and relying on Marty to tell me it's all going to be fine. You need to stay focused on that. If you let yourself get overwhelmed by everything that's going to happen between now and then, you'll get sucked under. No flood pun intended. I've been making them too. I told Marty earlier that I was drowning in information, and she stuck her tongue out at me. Weird how so many of our expressions have to do with water, and how in the face of a flood, they stop being funny. Yeah. So, are you going to be able to sleep tonight? Sure hope so. Tomorrow's going to be crazy. Do the best you can. Hang in there, sis. And we're all going to do what we can to help. This is a family effort. Thanks, Galen. See you tomorrow. Candice hung up, then tiptoed down the hall to her room, hoping she hadn't woken up everyone in the house while she was on the phone. They all needed their sleep for what was to come. In church the next morning, the pastor held up the stack of leftover pamphlets and encouraged everyone who had missed the meeting to take one on their way out. Many members of the congregation did grab one before leaving the building, and she was so glad to see that. Back at the McClain's house, things were a little chaotic until Barbara held up both hands. All right, everyone, listen up. We're going to have a nice Sunday meal, and then we'll discuss everything we still need to do. One thing at a time. We'll think better on full stomachs, and if this is the last Sunday dinner we have for a while, I want it to be nice. Why would it be the last dinner, Mom? Tracy asked. Because we don't know what we're going to be doing next Sunday. We might be digging mud out of someone's basement or building fences, whatever needs to be done. Dinner's going to be a little farther down on the priority list. Well, our place just might be in the path of the water, and we don't want to cancel dinner, Tracy replied. It's one of the things that keeps us united as a family, and we need to keep doing it, even if we're eating off bark plates in the middle of the woods. Oh, I was hoping you'd say that, Barbara said as she threw her arms around Tracy's shoulders. Not about the bark plates, because I think that's disgusting, but about wanting to have dinner together. It's my favorite part of the week. Candice made sure Greg loaded up on all her mother's specialties. She didn't want him missing anything. Her own plate wasn't nearly as full, though, and she realized that she didn't have much appetite. You've got to eat, Rebecca said, speaking softly in her ear. I know you're stressed, but you've got to get some fuel in there. It just sits on my stomach and doesn't want to budge, Candice said. Then get some liquids. Some of that instant breakfast stuff. Does Mom have any in the cupboard? I think so, yeah. I'll go mix some up for you. Candice felt a little embarrassed that her sister was waiting on her, but at the same time, it was kind of nice to be watched over. At the conclusion of the meal, Barbara stood up. All right, I hereby proclaim dinner to be over, and you can start discussing everything we need to do to prepare for tomorrow. Each person reported on what they were doing and what still needed to be done. Bob and Barbara would be heading back out to the boys' ranch that afternoon, where Bob would help the men and boys work on sandbags, and Barbara would help Meredith and Lillian prepare food for volunteers and displaced persons. They'd get as much done in advance as they could, saving the final steps for the next day. Zachary and Jeremy were going to help Steve finish plowing up the dirt wall on his property, and Kent and Jessica would start going door to door to see if they could get anyone else interested in listening to them. The fact that we have some sunshine today is going to confuse the issue, Candice said. People are going to think the danger is past, and they're going to be harder to talk to. Then we'll just have to be extra convincing, Jessica replied with a smile. I talked to Heather right before church this morning, Barbara said. She wishes she could be here to help, and she says she's praying for us. I think Idaho is the perfect place for her to be. If she was here, we'd be evacuating her out. She's having 4 babies. Tracy said. That might be the only thing keeping her from hopping on a plane and heading down here, Barbara replied. As the oldest, she feels responsible for you all. And she doesn't like missing out on the fun, Jessica added. The discussion continued, and Candice felt like everyone was chipping in and that they were using their talents in the best ways possible. She didn't notice until nearly the end that Marty had been pretty quiet during the conversation. Marty, what's the matter? Marty shook her head, then turned to Steve. Finish that wall tonight, and then you and Tracy need to evacuate. What? I thought we'd be safe once we built that retainer. Your house will be fine, but there's something. I'm not quite clear. Some kind of danger. But you need to be off that property by the time the water hits. You'll come stay with us, Barbara said. I'll get your old room ready. Jessica laughed. This is kind of Mom's dream, all her daughters coming home again. I do like having you here, but I wish we could leave the disasters out of it, Barbara replied. And speaking of disasters, we need to clean up the kitchen before we all go our various ways. Greg had gotten a little lost in all the hustle and bustle, but he and Candice volunteered to dry the dishes that wouldn't fit in the dishwasher, and that gave them a chance to talk. So, tell me you loved my mom's potatoes, Candice said. Of all the things I need to know about you, that one's the most important. I did love your mom's potatoes, and I wouldn't mind eating them on a fairly regular basis, Greg replied. Do you have the recipe? I do, but Mom's kind of funny that way. She'll tell you how to make it, but there's always some kind of little tip or trick left out, so yours won't be quite as good as hers. Greg laughed, handing Candice a platter to put away. Tricky little thing, isn't she? Oh, very. We still love her, though. With the kitchen cleaned up and all the leftovers put away, Candice and Greg went into the living room, which was now much emptier. What do you think Marty meant when she said that Tracy and Steve needed to evacuate? Greg asked. I don't know. I've been trying to figure that out. Candice sat still for a moment, trying to focus. I can feel the storm gearing up for a massive onslaught, no doubt about it. But I can't tell what that has to do with Steve and Tracy. That's not really my gift, though. I predict the weather. I don't predict other stuff. And that's another reason why I think you'd be great working at the Red Cross. Because I don't predict other stuff? No, because you predict the weather. Think of the good you could do if the Red Cross had a little heads up about when the next disasters were going to hit. Candice tilted her head to the side. Huh. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I guess it's kind of a given. Do you think I should tell them about my gift when I apply? I don't know about when you apply, that might raise a few eyebrows. But maybe after you've worked there for a little bit and have a supervisor you can trust. Like Rebecca did at the hospital. Look at us, talking like I'm actually getting the job. Candice laughed. We should probably be taking this one step at a time. Probably, but it's fun to think about. He leaned forward and picked up her hand, playing with her fingers and making tingles run up her arm. There's a question I've been wanting to ask you all day. He wasn't playing with her left hand, so chances were, he wasn't about to pull out a ring, but she still found her breath catching in her throat. Yeah? When Marty hinted that we should date, was she looking into the future, or was she just making a suggestion? Candice swallowed, but it turned into a cough, and it took a moment for her to regain her composure. I'm not exactly sure, she said at last. I mean, it kind of sounded like a precog thing, but it could have just been a meddling sister thing too. How can you tell the difference? Well, sometimes I can't. They sound an awful lot alike. And she backpedaled a little bit when I asked her about it. So, basically, I don't know. I see. Greg kept playing with her fingers. I've always wanted to choose my own way and make my own choices, and I've never liked the idea of someone coming along and telling me what I had to do. If a psychic or something had told me that you and I should get married, I'd probably head the opposite direction, just because I'm so stubborn. But if that's what Marty's seeing, well, it's different. It makes me feel hopeful, not coerced. And I want to see if that's what fate really holds for us. So, you're saying that you've gone from wanting to date me to wanting to check out the next level? Yeah. And just so I'm clear, I mean, let's talk about getting married. Wow. Candice sat back a little. You've seen all the craziness I live with, and you've seen my weaknesses, and you've gotten to know my weird family a little more, and you want to talk about marrying me?" He grinned. "Yes, I've seen the craziness and I've met your weird family, but I don't see weaknesses. I see amazing strengths. Let's talk about getting married. But again, to be clear, I'm not proposing at this exact second. I think maybe waiting until after the flood hits would be a good idea. But we can see what the idea feels like." Warmth spread from her stomach out to the tips of her fingers. "So far, it feels pretty good." "It does, doesn't it?" He leaned forward and gave her a quick kiss. "Now, let's go save the town." She gave him a wobbly smile. "Yes, let's." Chapter 8. Of all the difficult aspects of this situation, this was likely the most difficult, knowing exactly when to spring into action. Candice, Marty, and their parents had stayed up late Sunday night talking things over, and they decided that they needed to create more evidence to convince the townspeople that they were in danger. Bob volunteered to drive up to the dam at first light and come back with a report that it was weakening. That was true, whether or not the weakness was visible. Then they could get busy before the water actually hit. Everyone was up and dressed at dawn, and Candice found it hard to sit still as she waited for her dad to get back. She and Greg wouldn't be seeing each other until later that day, as Greg would be manning the ham radio and she'd be out helping, but they'd spoken to each other soon after she got up, and that would have to sustain her until she could see him later. He really did give her stability, and even if he did end up back in his wheelchair, he would be a strength in her life. She was becoming more convinced of that all the time. When Bob pulled into the driveway, Candice threw open the front door and ran outside. "Are we set to go?" she asked. "Can we start telling people?" He put a hand on her shoulder, then looked up at Barbara and Marty, who were standing on the porch. "The dam has started to crack. We now have all the visible evidence we need." This was good news, but goosebumps still rose on Candice's arms. "I'll call the police," Barbara said, heading toward the phone. "And it's time for us to sandbag," Candice said. She and Marty climbed into Bob's vehicle, and they drove out toward the river. The trucks from the McClain boys' ranch were already out there, as arranged, and within minutes, teenage boys were everywhere, pulling sandbags from the back of the truck and putting them in place. None of the boys knew about the McClain gifts. They believed they were helping prepare, just in case, but they all had good attitudes about it. With Steve's dirt furrow to guide the water one direction and the sandbags to keep it from drenching the houses across the way, Candice felt they'd done everything they could with this part of town. They moved farther in, placing bags in each spot Marty had indicated, and Candice couldn't stop feeling surge after surge of gratitude that they had these helpers and these resources to rely on. Jonathan hadn't even hesitated to arrange for tons of sand to be delivered once he'd heard the news, and Peter had spoken to the boys and rallied them. It had all come together so smoothly. Candice glanced at her watch. It was 10:30. "All right," she said to Peter. "We've done everything we can out here. Why don't you take the boys back to the ranch and be prepared for whatever happens next? We're going to be sending people your way." He nodded. "Will do. Be safe." She gave a nod in return. "You too." The sound of a police siren, giving one quick blip, came from behind her, and she turned to see Zachary pulling up. When he got out, he said, "My captain's got all units on standby." "Great. Now it's just a matter of time." As Candice and her family members moved to higher ground, she could almost hear an alarm clock ticking in the back of her head. She and her sisters had each tested their gifts and knew their limitations, but this was the first time anything had been so specific. In half an hour, she'd know if she really could sense things that accurately, or if she was just getting fixated on a time in her head. The rain was now pounding down with fury. She hadn't paid it much attention while they'd been working because she was so used to it by now, but it refused to be ignored any longer. Everywhere it struck her skin, it hurt, and she tugged the sleeves of her jacket down further to cover her arms. A moment later, Jessica joined her on the small hill where she stood. "We went door to door all along the water's route and told the people what Dad saw," Jessica called out over the sound of the rain. "We told them they need to evacuate, and to go to the boys' ranch if they didn't have anywhere else to be." "Good job," Candice called back. She hoped that at least some families had taken the initiative and left the night of the meeting, but she couldn't count on that. And then she heard a sound that ripped through the air and terrified her down to her bones. First there was a crack, and then the rushing of water. It was like the thundering of thousands of horse hooves. She didn't know if it was actually that loud, or if she could only hear it that well because she'd been listening for it. The rain was loud enough on its own that it should have muffled some of the sound, but it didn't. It rumbled toward them, and she gripped Jessica's hand tightly. Zachary had moved his police car several streets away and had come back. He now stood in position to keep cars and pedestrians from using that road. Candice knew that everyone at the hospital was ready for injuries. Dr. Hunsaker, the chief of staff, had listened to every word Rebecca said because he was aware of her gifts. Everyone had done their part, and now it was time. When the water rushed into town, Candice gasped and wondered why on earth she was out here watching it. It was the most frightening thing she'd ever seen. It was pulling up trees as it passed. It took a car parked along the side of the road and lifted it like it was nothing more than a toy, sending it downstream. Candice turned and watched as the water hit against the sandbags, praying they'd piled them high enough. Down the road, she saw as the water encountered Steve's dirt wall and veered where he'd planned for it to go. "It's working," Jessica said, squeezing Candice's hand. "Everything you thought out, it's working." Candice closed her eyes and breathed a silent prayer of thanks. If everything held, if nothing broke down. Her eyes flew open when she heard a sizzling sound and a series of pops. She looked around frantically, trying to identify the source of the noise, and then she saw it. The power poles that lined the edge of Steve and Tracy's property had been loosened by the floodwater and were starting to tumble down, pulling the lines with them. A huge and expansive pool of water stood beneath those lines, and Candice knew that if anyone touched that water, they'd get electrocuted. She scrambled down the hill, looking for anyone who could help her. Zachary would have a radio in his car, as would any of the officers. So would the ambulance drivers. She just had to find someone, anyone who could call the city and get that line cut, or even someone who could cut the line themselves. Now she understood why Steve and Tracy couldn't be on their property. Chances were, they'd have been electrocuted by now. "Candice!" She heard Jessica scream. "Where are you going?" She turned. She could barely see her sister through the driving rain. "Gotta get help," she yelled back. "Electricity." She pointed at Steve's farm, but she didn't know if Jessica heard her. At any rate, she had to keep going. She reached the bottom of the hill and ran alongside the rush of water, careful to keep several feet between herself and it. She could see a group of people up ahead. If she squinted, they looked like police officers. Perfect. Just then, though, as she took her next step, the muddy ground beneath her gave way, and she slipped sideways, going into the water. It scooped her up and carried her along just as easily as it had any of the other debris it had collected along its path. She screamed, clawing, trying to get back to the bank, but the force of the water was too strong, and she couldn't get out. She opened her mouth to scream again, but one of the trees that was being carried along with her spun around and smacked her in the side of the head, and she blacked out. Greg came back from his early morning physical therapy appointment and waited by the phone, knowing he'd be updated as soon as it was time. As soon as he got the phone call telling him that the dam was cracking, he positioned himself at his radio and spread the word. Radio operators all over the area responded, saying they were on standby and would send help as needed. It wasn't long before he was calling in those promised favors. He didn't know how long he stayed on that radio, acting as the hub of information. Jeremy had strung the phone cord through the apartment and set up the phone next to the radio so he'd have multiple ways to communicate, and he found himself taking phone reports almost as often as he was updated by radio. His back was getting sore and he desperately wanted to lie down, but he couldn't stop what he was doing. His role in this was too important. After several hours, things seemed to die down a bit as people were moved to safety and the immediate danger was past. The force of the water was dissipating the farther it went, some of it was seeping into the ground, but also it was spreading wider as it took its new path. It would be a horrendous muddy mess for a long time to come, but the initial crisis was over, and now it was time for cleanup efforts to begin. "Greg?" He turned as he heard his brother come into the apartment. "Here. How's it going out there?" Jeremy stood in the doorway to the spare room, drenched and covered in mud. "Pretty much as expected. Some downed power lines. Some backed up sewers. Some basements filled with mud. A few injuries, but no deaths, at least, none that have been reported so far. Fences down, stuff like that." He paused. "There's one thing, though." Greg studied his brother's face. "What?" "Candice got caught in the water." Greg came to his feet. He hadn't stood for hours, and his knees buckled immediately, sending him right back into his chair. "Details. She's at the hospital with a head injury. She's still unconscious, but Rebecca says she'll be all right. She just needs time for the swelling to go down." "What was she doing in the water?" "I thought the whole point of this thing was not to go in the water. As near as we can tell from what Jessica said, she was worried about an electricity problem at Steve and Tracy's. She waved and pointed that direction before taking off. Sure enough, there were some downed power lines, and they had to be cut before anyone got hurt. It would have been easy for one of the volunteers to step in some of that charged water. I knew trying to save the town would get her in trouble. If Greg didn't have Rebecca's assurance that Candice would be all right, he'd probably be vomiting with worry by now. As it was, he could barely keep his hands from trembling. "How are the roads? Is it possible to get through? I know the main streets on the far side of town are all closed." "We can get there. In fact, I brought an ambulance with me just in case we need a little extra credibility." Greg stood up again, more slowly this time, and moved over into his wheelchair. Within minutes, they were on their way, and when they pulled up at the hospital, Jeremy was able to get them right in to see Candice. Rebecca was standing next to her, holding her hand. "She'll be all right," she said as soon as she saw Greg. "She whacked her head on something, but she's been stitched up, and once the swelling has gone down, she'll wake up. She's going to be stiff and sore, and she'll probably be pretty grumpy for a few days until the pain subsides, but that's it. No residual injuries, nothing." "Oh, thank God," Greg said, glancing at the ceiling. He might not be in a church at the moment, but he'd never felt closer to the heavens than at that moment. "And thank you," he said to Rebecca. "I didn't do anything," she replied. "You've told me she'll be all right. That means everything." Rebecca smiled. "Well, now that you're here, I'll go check in on my other patients." She left the exam area, and Greg wheeled himself over to the bed. Candice looked so small and pale. She had a white bandage around her head, and he could see bruises in her face and arms. He wondered just what all she'd hit up against in the current of the flood. He pressed his fist to his mouth, trying not to make a sound as he thought about everything that could have happened to her. Yes, Marty had predicted that no lives would be lost, but didn't the future change all the time based on people's spontaneous choices? What if he'd lost Candice that day? Rebecca came back a while later and pressed a sack into his hands. "Some sandwiches from the cafeteria," she said. "They aren't the best, but you've got to eat." He unwrapped the first one and took a bite without tasting it. "How long until she wakes up?" Rebecca touched Candice's wrist. "About half an hour," she said. Enough time for you to eat and move around a little bit. Jeremy told me you were on the radio all day, your back must be killing you. She paused. Yes, it is killing you. Move around a little. Hey, I like hiding my infirmities from people. If you keep outing me, this is going to get awkward. I'm here for your own good, she retorted. Fine, fine. He finished eating, then stood, wincing. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been tightened like the strings on a violin. Will you stay with her for a few minutes? Absolutely. He walked up and down the hall a few times, located the men's room, and then came back. Rebecca was checking Candice's vitals, and Bob and Barbara had arrived. How are things out at the ranch? He asked. Going well. They did some rearranging and were able to place 6 families in their cabins, and we fed dozens of volunteers and displaced persons, Barbara reported. We drove one of the trucks right into town and served sandwiches out both sides. Peter and Lillian are taking a turn now. We had to be here as soon as we heard about Candice. Greg glanced at the clock. It had nearly been the 30 minutes Rebecca had promised. As if responding to his thought, Candice moaned, and her hand flew to her head. What's going on? She mumbled. You got carried away in the flood, and you hit your head, Rebecca told her. Mom and Dad are here, and so's Greg. Candice tried several times to open her eyes, and finally succeeded. She blinked a few times, then jolted awake. The electricity. Someone needs to cut the lines, Dad, make them cut the lines. They did, Candy Kane, Bob said, putting his hand on her shoulder. Jessica was able to help them figure out what you wanted, and the power's been cut. She relaxed. Okay. That's good then. Yes, it is, dear, Barbara soothed. You just rest. Don't worry about a single thing, everything's under control. Candice nodded and seemed to drift off again. Greg was disappointed that he hadn't gotten to speak to her, but he was so relieved that she was no longer in a coma, he'd accept whatever he could get. A moment later, though, she held out her hand. Greg? He moved to her side and squeezed her fingers. Right here. Good. Listen. She licked her lips, but didn't open her eyes. I like holding your hand. Like, a lot. He smiled. I like it too. Okay. I'm tired. Stop being interesting so I can go back to sleep now. He looked up at Bob and Barbara, then over at Rebecca. I think she's going to be just fine. Chapter 9. Candice sat on the couch in her parents' living room, her head pounding, as she listened to everyone report on the things that had been taking place over the last few days. She'd only been released from the hospital an hour ago, but she didn't want to wait, she needed to know. Had they been successful? The reports she'd been given at the hospital weren't complete. Now that the rain has stopped, we've been able to help people rebuild their fences and drain out their basements, Zachary said. The sandbags kept the damage to a minimum. I really think some homes would have been lost without them. The power company has to completely restring our property, and we won't have full power for a while, but it seems a small price to pay, Steve added. Thank you for spotting that, Candice. Well, it was sparking like a 4th of July fireworks display, so I couldn't help but notice it, she replied. She was so pleased to hear how everything was shaping up, and how the community was coming together to make sure everyone had what they needed. It was one of the things she loved most about small-town living. After she'd heard all the reports, Candice said goodbye to her sisters, who had been instructed, by their mother, to let Candice rest. When the last car drove away, she turned and looked at Greg, who hadn't moved. I thought everyone was supposed to go away and let me rest, she said teasingly. I don't think she meant me. I'm a very restful person to have around. Oh? If that's true, why does my heart beat faster whenever you're around? Because I'm extremely good for your cardiac health. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she rested her head on his chest. Her poor, poor head. She wondered if she'd ever stop feeling like a cracked coconut. "You know, I was thinking about something on my way over here," he said. She could feel his deep voice rumbling through his chest against her cheek. "Would you say that the flood is over?" "Well, yes. The flood is over, but the aftermath will take a little longer to clean up." He nodded. "Absolutely. But the flood itself is over, right?" "Yes. Pretty sure I just said that." "Okay. Because I had to be sure." She sighed. Her head hurt too much for this. "Sure of what?" "Well, it seems to me that you and I were going to talk about the possibility of marriage for a little while, and then after the flood, we'd see about getting engaged." There went her heart rate again. "But we never actually did talk about the possibility," she pointed out. "We were too busy sandbagging and getting stitches in our heads and stuff." "True, but I don't see any harm in fast-forwarding a little. We had every intention of talking about it, didn't we? That means we can move to the next step without guilt. I like not having guilt." "Me too." He rubbed her shoulder. "Candice, I'm in love with you. I think I have been since we first met, but I was so afraid of what the future held, or didn't hold, that I didn't let myself recognize my feelings. Now I'm not afraid anymore, because I know that whatever comes our way, we can face it together. Will you marry me?" She leaned back and looked at him. "That was a very nice proposal." "Thank you. I thought of it myself." "You're quite talented." Now I'm blushing. She grinned. "I'll tell you what. I'll agree to marry you if you promise that when you kiss me, you'll be very careful with my head." He seemed to contemplate that. "Yes, I can do that." "Then yes, I'll marry you." Very, very slowly, and very, very carefully, he slid his hand behind her head and brought her closer for the sweetest, most wonderful kiss she'd ever had in her whole life. The whole family gathered at the McClain's house the following Sunday afternoon to celebrate Candice's engagement to Greg. It was wall-to-wall people, but that's exactly the way she loved it. She and Greg hadn't set any definite dates yet. That would all depend on what she learned when she went back to San Antonio with him to look into a job with the Red Cross. It was a long shot and she knew it, but the police chief and the mayor had each written her a letter of recommendation for all her good work during the flood, and she hoped that would open a few doors at least. After everyone had eaten, Rebecca stood up and looked around nervously. "So, this is Candice and Greg's party, but Jeremy keeps nudging me to say something. And if he doesn't stop it, I'm going to be more bruised than Candice." "Oh, so funny," Candice replied. Her bruises were fading, but they were still plenty painful. "So, basically, I've been accepted to medical school," Rebecca said, and gasps went up all around the room. "I knew it," Marty said smugly. "You realize that when you're a precog, you don't get to be smug, right?" Tracy told her. "Why not?" "That takes half the fun out of it," Marty retorted. "Oh, honey, you're going to be the best doctor ever," Barbara said, hugging Rebecca tightly. "So, this means that I'll be moving to San Antonio, and Jeremy's going to see about transferring back there. We'll live there together after we get married, obviously, but I want to practice here, so after I'm done with school, we'll see about moving back." Rebecca gave a nod. "And that's all I have to say, so I'll now turn the time over to Candice." I don't have anything to follow that up with," Candice said. "You already know we're engaged, so saying it again wouldn't be exciting, and you already know there was a flood and stuff. I think Rebecca's news wins." "I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to steal your spotlight," Rebecca said. "That's all right. I'm happy for you, no matter when you announce it." Candice took Greg's hand and looked around the room. There sat most of the people she loved most in all the world. Heather wasn't there, of course, but so much love filled that house, It felt as though it would burst at the seams. Now she realized that her gift was just as important as anyone else's in the family. She and Marty together had done something incredible. They'd taken a situation that would have cost lives, and instead created a situation that would only take a few more weeks to clean up. With their family behind them, they'd made a tremendous difference. She turned to look at Greg, studying his features. She had no idea what the future held for them. She'd leave that to Marty. What she did know was that come what may, they were going to make an awesome team. They'd already proven it in one whale of a tough challenge, and there was another water pun. She grinned to herself. She had a feeling she was going to be very, very happy with this man.